In this video, we're going to be going through 10 of the best units in Rome Total War Barbarian Invasion. Before we get into it, something I want to mention is that obviously it's not hugely clear how you can compare, for example, the best archer units to the best cavalry units. After all, they play completely different roles. However, if you've got an archer unit which is significantly better than the average archer, and a cavalry unit which is only slightly better than typical cavalry, then it's pretty obvious which one would be more likely to make the list. This is best seen as a list of 10 units to look out for when you play Barbarian Invasion. The individual rankings don't really matter too much. So let's begin with number 10, the Lombard Berserkers. I have to admit, when I went to get a recording of these in action for this video, it actually went so well that I had to seriously ask myself whether I should be ranking them even higher. Because as you can see, they are absolutely incredible at taking out opposing infantry. If you can get them safely into the thick of your opponent's infantry units, they're pretty much unstoppable. In my recent Lombardy campaign, I myself had a battle where I had to fight a stronger force of barbarians uphill, and I don't think I would have stood a chance without the morale penalty my berserkers were inflicting on my opponents. And speaking of campaign, they're actually incredibly easy to recruit. You only need a first tier shrine to recruit them. So why are they only ranked number 10? To be fair, the vast majority of units wouldn't have made it onto the list in the first place, but berserkers do have some significant weaknesses. The obvious one is they go berserk, meaning you have almost no control over what they attack or when. Sometimes they'll go charging into a mass of opponents and get killed before you're ready to actually use your other units. Other times they'll decide to run down a unit of peasants and you won't see them again till the end of the fight. But their main weakness is that they really do perform a lot better against infantry than other types of units. They have almost no protection against arrow fire, and they're not able to use their launching attack against cavalry, so they can go down surprisingly quickly. Still, if you use them in the right situations, they're easily one of the best units in the game. At number 9, we have the Francisca Heerban of the Franks. For Age of Empires fans out there, these are your throwing axemen. The thing that makes Francisca Heerban so strong is that both weapons they can use are armor piercing, so you can choose whether to simply charge them in or hold them back to throw their axes as many times as possible. Their raw stats are good enough to defeat most of the game's weaker units, but their armor piercing ability also means they can perform extremely well against stronger units. In the campaign, they're also fairly cheap, so it's surprisingly easy to mass them up. I will give my first honourable mention here to the Chosen Axemen. If you can charge a unit of Francisca Heerban before they can throw their axes, Chosen Axemen will actually beat them 1v1. However, because they have no ranged attack, they're less versatile, and in campaign in particular, they're more likely to get worn down over time. Coming in at number 8, we have the Sarmatian Armoured Archers. Something that's particularly noticeable about the Barbarian Invasion expansion is the large number of horse archers. In fact, the majority of factions have access to some kind of horse archer, but the Sarmatian Armoured Archer is more or less the best standard horse archer. By that I mean it's the best at hit and run tactics. If you're looking for a pure horse archer just to soften up the opponents as much as possible before the rest of your units get involved, these are more or less the best units available. However, it doesn't really make sense to talk about these without comparing them to my number 7, the Hunnic Elite Warriors. At first glance, they do look like very similar units, but they play slightly different roles. For one thing, Hunnic Elite Warriors have a slightly higher attack stat, so they're more effective when it comes to simply doing damage. They also have more soldiers in each unit, which is the main reason I've ranked them above the Sarmatians. The reason I describe the Sarmatian Armoured Archers as the best pure horse archer is because they have 3 extra armor compared to the Hunnic Elites. That means they're significantly less likely to go down when the enemy shoots back. However, Hunnic Elite Warriors do have better stats when it comes to close combat. If you plan to actually charge your horse archers into your opponents from time to time, the Hun unit is better overall, just because it can double as a fairly strong light cav unit. In 6th place, I've gone for the Goth Raiders, and this is probably the most straightforward inclusion on the list. Simply put, Goth Raiders are the best foot archers in the expansion. Out of all archers, they have the joint highest range and attack, and as foot archers, they're particularly helpful when going up against opposing horse archers, which, as I already mentioned, there are many. They're very similar to Steppe Raiders, who are mostly identical to them, but they have slightly higher defenses. They're also surprisingly effective in close combat. Obviously, you should try to keep them protected, but a lot of the time they'll actually be more effective if you turn them around and have them fight hand to hand instead of run away. It also means they can beat opposing archers both from distance and up close. Something else worth mentioning is that the Goths in particular have some really solid sword and spear units, so it's surprisingly easy to protect your archers even if your opponents do get up close. Moving on now to number 5, we have our first straightforward cavalry unit, the Paladins. Paladins are the best shock cavalry units in the game. They have a charge bonus of 10, so they're easily capable of breaking most units they hit. They also pair particularly well with the Franziska Heerban because their axes will soften up your opponents before the charge. Also, the Franziska Heerban have a very high defense stat, which makes it easier to hold your opponents in place while you position your paladins behind them. Apart from their charge bonus though, they don't have a huge amount to help them overcome heavily armoured opponents and spearmen. So overall they're best seen simply as strong all-around cavalry. Number 4, another cav unit, this time the Equites Clibanarii of the Eastern Roman Empire. Now when I was doing my research for this video, I came across a thread on a forum where there was a vicious argument going on about whether these are actually stronger than paladins or not. The bottom line is they are about as good as each other, but they also do slightly different things. Paladins are amazing shot cavalry, but they won't perform as well if you leave them in a fight. They're best used for their mobility and for their charge bonus. The Equites Clibanarii, on the other hand, are superior when it comes to grinding down your opponents in close combat. They have the armor-piercing mace, which makes them especially good at taking down elite units. Like paladins, they come with a standard number of cavalry soldiers per unit, which means they compare favourably with other elite units, such as the Grail Knights and General's Bodyguard units, which are sometimes held back by their lack of numbers. Because of their high stats and their armor-piercing maces, the Equites Clibanarii are most comparable to the cataphracts from the main Rome Total War. That's because the cataphracts you find in Barbarian Invasion, which belong to the Sassanids, don't actually have the armor-piercing mace, and neither do the Grail Knights. So overall, these are probably the best standard cavalry unit in the game when it comes to conventional hand-to-hand fighting. At number 3, we have, in my opinion, the best infantry unit in the game, the Comitatenses First Cohort. You may remember the first cohorts from the main game, which have a higher soldier count than normal cohorts, but don't quite match up to the urban cohorts when it comes to stats. The Comitatenses First Cohort do not have this problem. They have the highest stats soldier for soldier out of all your infantry units, in addition to having 50% more soldiers per unit. They even have higher stats than the normal Comitatenses, so even if they lost a third of their number, they would still be your best infantry man for man. That's in addition to the fact that they carry the Eagle, which increases the morale of all your surrounding units. So these are basically your meat grinder units. They will grind down pretty much any opponent 1v1. The only exception is armor-piercing units, but even then, most armor-piercing units will find themselves outnumbered and badly damaged by the Pila before they can actually do any damage. And with that, we have covered all of the standard units in Barbarian Invasion. The next two units are both General's Bodyguard units. General's Bodyguards are always solid, but the next two are exceptionally good. So number 2, we have the Imperial Household Bodyguard of the Eastern Roman Empire. This is essentially your standard bodyguard unit, but it has one major twist. Unlike most bodyguards, these actually come with an armor-piercing mace. You've probably noticed that a lot of the units I've talked about in this video have some kind of armor-piercing ability. That's because almost every elite unit in the game has a high armor stat, and that applies to both the original Rome and to Barbarian Invasion. The ability to ignore half your opponent's armor makes a unit significantly more deadly, but that's especially obvious on a General's Bodyguard unit because these are already some of the best units in the game. Man for man, there's pretty much nothing that can safely fight these. They do have the usual issue of only having a small number of soldiers per unit, but even that can be overcome in the campaign if your general has a high enough influence stat. There's almost no good way to beat this unit other than to completely surround it, ideally with heavy spearmen. But under your control, because they are fast-moving cavalry units, you can pretty easily avoid that situation. In short, the Imperial Household Bodyguard is the most powerful melee cavalry unit in the game. At least kind of. Before we go on to number 1, I'll give a few honourable mentions, although there are plenty more I could include here. Having just mentioned heavy spearmen, I think it's worth acknowledging the two best spearmen units in the game. These are the Auxilia Palatina of the Western Roman Empire and the Bosporan Infantry. Comparing these two, Auxilia Palatina have the better defences, but Bosporan Infantry have higher attack. There isn't a huge difference between them in terms of stats, but in my experience, the Bosporan Infantry does tend to win the fight 1v1. It's also worth mentioning the Hounds of Kulan, a unit very similar to the Lombard Berserkers. Unlike the Lombard Berserkers, they do have the armor-piercing ability, but they also have lower stats. They're still great units, but the armor-piercing ability isn't actually that useful on a Berserker-style unit, and most of the time you're better off just having higher stats. I have tried to focus this list on strength over cost efficiency, but the Celts also have access to the Galloglasses, which are noteworthy just for being extremely cheap elite infantry units. Finally, I'll give an honourable mention to the Grail Knights. When I mentioned these earlier, I was talking about how they don't have armor-piercing maces, and they only have a very low soldier count per unit. However, it's still worth mentioning them just because when it comes to raw stats, they are one of the best standard units. So now we come to my number one choice for the strongest unit in Barbarian Invasion, the Clibanarii Immortals. These are the default General's Bodyguard unit of the Sassanids, and they're the closest thing the game has to a unit with no counters. It's almost like the developers got bored and wanted to see what would happen if they took all the best cavalry units in the game and combined them into one. At first glance, they're very similar to the Cataphract Archers from the main game. They've got an extremely high armor stat and they take almost no damage from opposing archers. Unlike Cataphract Archers though, they have 2 hit points, so you're less likely to lose one to a single lucky hit. Soldier for soldier, they're easily the best horse archers in the game, but the main reason they're number one is their secondary weapon. Unlike the Sassanid Cataphracts, the Immortals do actually have access to the armor-piercing mace as their backup weapon. So even if they do get caught in close combat, they still fight about as well as the Imperial Household Bodyguard would. Weak units can't break through their armor, and elite units can only fight them with half their usual armor stat. That means trying to chase them down with cavalry is usually a waste of time, unless you can completely surround them. So they have options against cavalry, they take almost no damage from opposing archers, and they can easily outrun and shoot down infantry units like spearmen. And that's why, in my opinion, they have no real counters. Their only legitimate weakness is the soldier count they get as a result of being bodyguards. But even this isn't much of a problem in the campaign because you can increase the number of immortals per unit by increasing your general's influence stat. Also, if you're given the option to adopt a new family member, the game will literally give you a unit of these for free. So from my perspective, this unit alone is one of the key reasons why the Sassanids have a claim to being the best faction in the game. Apart from the fact they have a low soldier count, as absurd as it sounds, probably the closest thing they have to a weakness is that they can run out of arrows. In that situation, if you have enough spearmen left, you might be able to draw them into a bad fight. Otherwise, you probably want to be outnumbering them about 10 to 1. Overall, Barbarian Invasion is a fairly balanced expansion, and most factions have access to at least 1 or 2 good units. So there are many other units I could have mentioned here, but these are probably the 10 units I'd say are especially worth being aware of. If you found the video interesting, do consider subscribing or checking out the Barbarian Invasion campaign linked in the description. I will be making more Rome Total War videos too, along with other strategy games, but that's all for now. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.